Good evening. This is Larry Reisman. I'm the community editor and columnist at TCPalm and the Press Journal and the rest of Treasure Coast newspapers. And we're here tonight with Blake Fontenay, our newest columnist. Wanted to get to know Blake and wanted to have the public get to know Blake. And if you have any questions, feel free to offer those in the comment section in Facebook or on YouTube. And so we'll start with Blake. Blake's been here a few weeks now, and maybe you could just introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, glad to do it. Welcome to all of you who are listening. My name is Blake Fontenay, and I'm a new columnist for TCPalm. I'm going to be focusing primarily on the St. Lucie and Martin County area, not so much Indian River County, although I will be writing about some issues that are of interest to the whole region. And I'm very excited to be back here. I'm a graduate of the University of Florida, and I worked in Florida during the early part of my career, not this far south, but I worked in Jacksonville and later for the Orlando Sentinel in various places around Central Florida. And my career took me, after Orlando, took me back to Tennessee, which is where I'm from originally. And I thought that I would only be back there a couple of years. I was really looking to kind of get experience in a different type of beat that I was really interested in at that time. And I thought I'd get a couple of years of experience in Memphis, and then I would be returning to one of the Florida newspapers soon. And you know what they say, life is what happens while you're making other plans. And so I was in Tennessee for quite a while. Got out of journalism briefly for about 8 years and worked as a communications officer for state government in Nashville. And then decided I wanted to get back into journalism, and specifically opinion writing journalism. So I was opinion page editor in Pueblo, Colorado, and then Boulder, Colorado. And then we moved back to Memphis briefly before I came here to TCPalm, and my wife and I are very excited to be here.
Sounds good. And so how long have you been here so far? Just a few weeks?
Just about a month, a little over a month. I started, my first day was actually after the 4th of July weekend, but you know, we had been in town for a few days trying to get to know the area before that. So a little over a month.
Any initial impressions of the Treasure Coast or of Stewart or St. Lucie County?
Well, I love it here. You know, it's really everything I was hoping it would be. It's hot, but you know, it's Florida. I knew that was going to be an issue, and you know, I'm just now trying to learn about things on the beat, and you know, I'm sort of putting together, you know, different bits and pieces from the people I'm talking to. Potential sources and future sources, and so yeah, that's what I've been doing.
So we've got Blake's email address on the screen if you want to email him story tips or questions, things like that. You know, feel free to do that. What are some of the issues that interest you so far that you've sort of gotten involved in or started to learn about?
One thing that has really been interesting is the issue of water and trying to protect the water and clean up the water. And the reason that that's so interesting is that, you know, to me, in this community, it seems like some of the traditional political rules don't apply. In other parts of the country where I've lived, you're either pro-environment or you're pro-business. And I don't really see that here. I see a lot of conservatives who are championing environmental issues related to water. And it makes sense to me because here the economy is so tied in with the water that, you know, you have to be pro-water if you're pro-business around here. And so that was one thing that really struck me. And I don't know if there are going to be other issues that are that way, but that definitely seems different to me than other places I've lived.
What are some of the issues that you see that you've maybe covered before that might overlap with some of the things going on here? I mean, think about Memphis or Colorado or anything like that? Or
Well, of course, down in Stewart, the Costco project is a big issue now, and I haven't covered a project exactly like that, but it's a familiar type of conflict where you've got land use cases and you've got people who are in favor of new growth and want new jobs and the new services that commercial businesses provide. And then on the other hand, you've got people who don't want the traffic, they don't want the extra noise, and it's just the type of issue that is a little different in each case, but there are also some commonalities if you have been around a while and have been covering local government beats.
what would you say the biggest? Can you remember the biggest story you covered related to that somewhere else that might be parallel? Kind of growth
I'm trying
story.
to think. As far as just a development project itself, they all kind of run together now. But a really big project that I was involved in covering for about 3 years while I was still a reporter in Memphis was the construction of the FedEx Forum, which is the arena where the Memphis Grizzlies NBA team plays. And I was the city hall reporter at the time the city first decided to reach out and try and get the Grizzlies to relocate from Vancouver, Canada. And they were ultimately successful in that, but there was still a process that went on for 3 years while they were building the arena. And, lots of stuff goes wrong on a big construction project like that. There were accidents where, there were a couple of construction workers who were killed. There were some labor issues, and just a lot of things happen when you're involved in a big, high-profile public project like that. So that probably was the biggest as a reporter that I covered.
So there are things to learn. That's one of the great things, in my opinion, about bringing in folks from outside is you can really learn a lot from experiences that journalists have had elsewhere. A lot of good questions to ask, things to know about. What else? What do you like to do in your spare time?
Well, when my foot's been acting up lately, but I love to canoe or kayak and bicycle. And so when I'm healthy again, I hope to be doing more of that and any kind of boating, really. Not really a sailor, but just getting out on the water is something that we've already done once since I've been here, and I hope it'll be just the first of many times we get out on some type of boat excursion. So I like to do that. I do some writing in my spare time. I haven't been real active the last couple of years, but I've written some novels and a short story and a play, so I enjoy that. And I like attending live theater as well. I was sort of halfway an actor in Memphis for the time I was there. I was involved in something called the Memphis Gridiron Show, which is something that a lot of communities do where reporters put on this show where they're basically doing songs and skits that are spoofing the elected and public officials in their town. And, it raises money for charity. And so I was involved with that basically the whole first 10 years I was in Memphis. So that, and not that I think that I have any acting chops as a result of that, but it did give me more of a appreciation for live theater and, when it's done well and what I was doing wrong.
And how did the politicians react to that?
Well, most of them were good sports about it. I mean, that was sort of a part of the fun of it is many of them were there in the audience, and most of them could laugh at themselves. A few of them not so much. And toward the end, one thing that I instituted was I allowed some of the elected officials, county commissioners and city council members, to do sort of a rebuttal skit where they made fun of the media. So, we kind of gigged each other, and that seemed to go over really well. So I guess
in your career, you've probably written things that public officials have not appreciated or liked. Is
Oh,
that fair to
sure.
say? Yeah.
Oh,
And how do
sure.
you deal with that, or what kind of relationship do you have to build to do
Well,
that? Or
I think it depends on the individual person and what kind of relationship you have with them. I mean, it just like anyone. I mean, you and I could have a discussion about issues that would be different from the discussion I would have with someone who just accosted me on the street. So, I think the key is really to try and build good relationships so they can withstand the tough times. When you write something that maybe somebody's not too happy about, but you have enough respect for each other that you can talk about it and move on. And there's not just a total feeling of hatred for over one issue or one story that didn't turn out quite the way somebody liked.
and when you're doing opinion journalism, I've always found it important to try to call the person before you write about it. Before you write about or criticize something that somebody said, or um, it really depends what you have to write. But I think having those open doors of communication, just so everybody knows that this is not a personal thing. It's always a professional. We're professionals. We have to sleep. We have to go to bed every night and be able to sleep through the night, not lay awake thinking that we've done something wrong. We have to look at the mirror every day.
Well,
We take this seriously.
I think that's really true. And the other thing that was pointed out to me is this is not, I wouldn't really call it a small community, but it's a tight knit community. And I'm very likely to see people that I've written about in the grocery store or on the beach or wherever. So it helps to have a relationship that's not just completely at odds, where you feel like you do have some kind of rapport with people. And there are times when that breaks down and it just gets to the point where you just can't get along with someone. But I try and avoid that. I don't think it's good as a column writer to be in that situation. So you want to hang on to those good relationships as long as you can.
Exactly. And why don't you tell me what you think the role is of an opinion journalist or columnist?
Well, I think this is my official title is community engagement columnist. And I take that middle word very serious. Well, the community is important too, but engagement, I think, is really the key. You want to write things that help people get engaged with what's going on in their community. And, it doesn't have to be necessarily something where I'm just spouting off my opinions, although I probably will from time to time. But, sometimes it's just a matter of looking at an issue and offering a little bit of analysis, maybe pointing out a different perspective that people haven't considered. And, that's one of the things, frankly, as a newcomer that I hope I can offer is a different perspective. I mean, if you've lived somewhere a really long time, sometimes it's hard to see things as clearly as an outsider can. And I hope I can use that to my advantage.
Definitely. What about the role? What about the role on the editorial board? You've worked on editorial boards before. How do you see that editorial board and the way it's set up here working to help the community?
Well, I think it's very important for readers to understand the difference between what a columnist writes and an editorial. And editorials are the institutional opinion of the entire newspaper, in this case, the three newspapers, and they reflect a consensus of the editorial board. That's why they're not signed. They're not just one person's opinion. They're what the entire board has talked about and said, this is, where we want to be on this issue as a newspaper. And as a opinion writer, a columnist rather, you've got more freedom to just express your own opinions. But even in that context, you want to be responsible. I mean, there's a disclaimer on my columns that say they're not the opinion of the newspaper, but they're publishing me, so I still want to reflect well, in what I write. So that's very important to me. But again, I think that distinction sometimes gets lost. People view editorials and columns interchangeably, and even more dangerous, they view our news coverage and opinion pieces interchangeably. And of course, there's a big difference there.
Exactly, and I think one of the things that most people don't seem to know. I shouldn't say most people, but many people don't seem to know. They ask me is how come you run opinion on the front page or something like that? And one of the things is that we've had a philosophy here to run the best content on the front page, and we clearly label it as opinion. There's a column signature with each of the things that we write. And then when you go back to the editorial page, that's where you get, sometimes a couple times a week, we'll express our own opinions as an editorial board, that collective group, which is tough to do sometimes, having to sit down and write an editorial that reflects the opinion of sometimes up to 6 or 7 people, 8 people.
And
trying
sometimes
to put that
it's not always possible to reach consensus. I know that's been an issue here and other places I've worked where, we've talked through an issue and we just couldn't get to a compromise that everyone could live with. And that's a difference too between, as a columnist, you're sort of free to do your own thing, but that you've got to be a little bit more compromising and collaborative when you're working on editorials.
Yeah, and the columns, I think, remind me of back when you were in high school and you took an expository writing class, and you had to have you obviously had a theme, but you had to make your make your statement. I can't remember all the lingo, but you made your declaratory statement, and then you kind of backed it up with supporting evidence to prove your point, which is kind of like an editorial too. But the columns are that's how I view the columns. Although sometimes. And you know what it's like, you're not always writing argumentative columns. You're writing think pieces. You may be writing a profile. What kind of columns do you like to write the most?
Well, I like to do all kinds. I think that, there will be times when I want to make a strong argument for something that is uniquely my opinion, is not the editorial board's opinion. But quite often, I think some of the best columns are just really breaking down an issue in a way that a news story sometimes can't. I mean, sometimes, having been a reporter, I know that, it's hard to get people to really see, if you've got two sides that are making arguments, then, sometimes it's hard to sort of cut through and sort out who's right. And I think as a columnist, that's something that I can attempt to do. I mean, not everyone's going to agree with me on every issue, but I think sometimes it's just a matter of, man, there's a lot of noise in the community about this issue. And, here's what I think you should know about this. Here's why I think it's the facts that I think are important.
I think I was muted there, but did you kind of do that with the Costco column that you wrote? You came into town and you tried to do some research, but you haven't been here long. And I think how did that work out? What was that like?
That's right. I mean, I went into it, and when I heard about the issue, I really felt like it was something I did need to write about. And we've got a reporter who's done a fine job of covering that issue from a news perspective. But I really wanted to weigh in with the column before it got to the city commission, which is coming up this Monday. But, as I got into it, the more I researched it, I think there's always this expectation with a controversial issue like that the columnist is going to say this side's right and this side's wrong. And as I thought about it, I really just didn't feel like I had been here long enough or had enough of a grasp of what Stewart is to say definitively, yes, we need a Costco and this other development, or no, we don't. Because I know there are sharply divided views about how much, if any, Stewart needs to grow and what type of growth it should be looking at. And I continue to monitor what's going on. I'm on social media, and anytime I see something about that project, among others, I'm interested in hearing what people have to say. So, if you're on social media and you're commenting on, some community page about that issue, I may be listening in. I may not comment in that forum, but I'm trying to get as much of a sense for what the community wants as I can. And of course, I'm planning to go to the meeting on Monday and see what happens. I know there will be a vigorous community debate before the commission takes it up. So I'm excited to see how that goes, because I think I'm going to learn a lot about Stewart that I don't know yet. So it's kind of an educational process.
And I think you got out into the community, was it last week or the week before, trying to talk to some folks involved in the project on both sides?
I did. And, it's always difficult to strike that balance. I'll tell you an expression that I heard a long time ago about legislating is, if everybody on all sides of an issue are unhappy with you, then you've come up with a good bill. And I think that sometimes applies to columns as well, because in that case, I've heard from both project supporters and opponents that they felt I was too skewed to the other side. So that tells me that I'm approaching at least something like a good balance.
Exactly.
Or I just totally missed it altogether, and that's why everybody's unhappy. So that's always a danger there too.
That's right. Do you ever have problems getting a hold of one side or the other? And how does that affect your reporting and the ability to tell that complete story?
Well, I did. That's an issue from time to time that I think all journalists struggle with. And in the case of Costco, I tried for more than a week to get an interview with either the project developer or a representative from Costco, and it didn't happen. But I felt like there was a lot of information out there, that I was able to get from other sources that told me about the project and why people thought it was, talking about the merits of it, striking the balance, between that and what opponents were saying. And so I did feel comfortable with that. I mean, you would always like to have the principals in any issue involved, but that's not always possible. And one thing that I will say that I am very attuned to is when I feel like one source believes that by not talking to me that they can kill a column. And that's not usually the way it works. I'm not going to say I'll never hold a column because I didn't hear from one person, but if I'm writing about an issue, particularly something that's controversial, and one side chooses not to respond after I've made what I feel is a good faith effort, then, they may not like what they see in the paper. I mean, because they had a chance to tell their side of the story and they didn't take that opportunity. And there are all kinds of different degrees to that. I mean, if I call someone, at 4:30 this afternoon and then file a story at 5 o'clock that says they couldn't be reached for comment, I haven't been fair to them. And, I know that from the time that I was out of journalism and working as a government communications officer, I have to say that happened to me a few times, and it really stings. But what I'm talking about is more people who try and game the system, if you will, by saying, well, if I don't return his calls, or I don't comment, then he's not going to write about my issue. That's like trying to ignore that rattle in your car. It's not going away on its own. It may not stay the same, but you're not going to like the progression of events after that.
Well, speaking of that government communications officer, you've seen it from both sides. what's your advice to folks that deal with the media? And then can you talk about that, and then the barriers that journalists have
Well,
to getting information nowadays?
there's there's kind of a stigma, if you're a journalist, people say you're going over to the dark side if you get into public relations or any kind of communications job that's not journalism. But I have to be honest, I actually wish I'd done that much earlier in my career, because it did give me the perspective of being the source and seeing how it feels to be on the other side of media coverage that isn't always favorable. And, I one thing that I tried to counsel the agencies that I worked for 3 different departments within state government. And within those departments, there were numerous divisions. So, the mentality within each of those divisions among the leaders was different. But, I tried to encourage them to cooperate with the media as much as possible. And, public records requests, for example, in Tennessee, there was there is a law that says you have to respond within 7 business days. And some of my clients, if you'll call them that, would say, well, let's wait 7 days and then respond. And it's like, this information doesn't reflect negatively on our department or this division, and it is public record. They're going to get it eventually. So why antagonize the reporter by hanging on to it longer than we really have to? I mean, if we can produce it in a day or 2, let's just go ahead and do it. And so, part of what I hope I accomplished was sort of getting rid of the siege mentality that I think some of those people had who hadn't had a lot of experience dealing with the media, and also just showing them the opportunities for favorable press. Because what I tried to point out was, if you just sit here and wait for the media to call, what they're going to call about is probably not going to be the good news that you want to get out about your organization. And you can't stop. I mean, there's going to be bad news. I mean, even in the best organizations, bad things happen. But what you can do is you can buy goodwill and a better opinion in the public's mind of your organization if you're talking about the good things you do. So I always thought that was important. There were times when I was responding to negative news and, crisis communications, whatever you'd like to call it. But the rest of the time I was out there trying to figure out what kind of messages I could get out about those departments that the media would be interested in and would help educate the public about the departments.
Well, and I think there's something to be said about, and I've never worked for government, but I think there's something to be said for getting out in front of a story. So if there's bad news or potentially bad news coming down the pike, maybe you made a mistake, you didn't mean to do it. Why not get out in front of the story and release whatever you have? I think it shows transparency, it shows trust, those kinds of things. Now, what you choose to release and what you can release, 2 different things. But when we're talking about government again, sometimes there are not a lot of journalists that work as government communications officials, and I don't think some of them always understand, as a lot of them do, and a lot of them are very good. But sometimes I think it's important for them to note, and for government officials to note, that those documents that they create, the meetings that they have, they're all a product of us, of the community, of the people that elect those officials, of the people that fund those officials' jobs, of the people that pay them to create those documents.
Right.
So it's the government is us, and so it's not it's a public record, but it's all of our records because we all contribute to that.
Well, and so often the agency that has the document doesn't even really have a dog in the fight. They're just the custodian of the record. So, why would you not want to release it? And there's a different category of public records requests. If, someone comes in and requests every arrest report and police department has had over the last 10 years, then, you should have an expectation that that's going to take longer to get, and that's going to probably cost more in terms of copying fees and prep fees. But for the simple requests, it just makes no sense to try and hang on to documents and not be cooperative when you're going to lose that battle eventually. I mean, if there's some question about whether or not a document is covered by an exemption to the public records law, well, sure, you want to be cautious and not release something prematurely, but usually that's not an issue at all. I mean, it's clearly a public document, and whether somebody wants to have it out there or not, it's going to be released eventually.
Yeah. So just changing gears here, we do have a question from a reader, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I'm going to. I'm doing the interview.
Go ahead.
It's not often I get to put my colleague on a spot, but I guess you're covering the Stewart City Council race, Group 4, which is coming up. Starting early voting starts Monday, I think. So,
right.
Were there any impressions you got from meeting the two candidates? I think you're going to be writing about that at some point, right?
Yes, I'm actually doing my Sunday column on that race, and I had a good time talking with both of them. I think that one of the candidates was somewhat reluctant to talk to me because of some issues in the past with the way the race was covered. These same two candidates ran a year ago, and what I tried to say is, basically I'm a clean slate. I mean, I'm the new guy in town, and whatever has happened in the past, I didn't have anything to do with. And that's not to say that I necessarily agree that our coverage was unfair, before I got here, but it's just a new day. And if you're talking to me for the first time, I hope that if you're a source out there listening to this, that the first time we talk, you don't feel like I'm going into something with a certain mindset just because of some story or column you've seen in the past that was written by someone else. I like to think I'm pretty independent in that way.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And that's another reason for me, I really appreciate the independent view that you bring to the table, because some of us, I've been around a long time here, and we start to see things certain ways. We try to be open-minded as much as possible, but it's good getting another side of eyes on the things that are going on. Changing gears a little bit, you wrote a column, I think it was last week, about a personal experience you had in Colorado related to the biggest story, probably the past year and a half, which is the COVID situation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I got COVID. Well, first of all, I think the two greatest fears people probably have had about this epidemic were how it could affect them economically, either through losing their job or hurting their business, and how it could affect them physically. And so I sort of lived through both of those experiences. In May, not long after the shutdown and everything, I was working for a newspaper that took a real financial hit. They lost a lot of advertising, and they laid some people off, and I happened to be one of them. So I was fortunate enough to get another job quickly, but I kind of thought, well, maybe that's my COVID experience, and that's the toll COVID took from me. But then in November, I actually caught COVID. Both my wife and I did, and it progressed in me to a point where I needed to be taken to an ICU, and that's where I stayed for 5 days under round-the-clock care. And my wife was not quite as sick as I was. She was at home, but she was bedridden and for several days. And then even after I got back from the hospital, it was a long recovery process. I was on oxygen for several more days, and then for a couple of weeks, I had no energy. It took uh, psyching myself up just to get up to do a simple chore like washing the dishes or feeding the cat. So, I know that many people experience COVID and have only minor symptoms, but I'm here to tell you, I wasn't in a high risk group. I don't have any kind of heart or lung ailment that would have made it seem like I was a candidate to get really sick. And yet I did. So I just hope that people won't play roulette and take a needless chance, because it's just not worth it. I mean, that was as sick as I've ever been in my life. And, you know, pretty much the whole time I was in the hospital, I didn't know if I was going to make it or not. And I could tell by the way the doctors were acting that they weren't sure about that either. I mean, I wasn't getting a lot of rah happy talk about, oh, you're going to be fine, particularly when I first got there. I mean, you could tell they were worried. And one of the first questions they asked me was whether or not I would consent to being put on a ventilator if that became necessary. And I said that I would, but I also, in the back of my mind, said I'm going to do everything I can to prevent that from happening, because I knew that would pretty much be a last stage of treatment before death, because that's sort of the last thing they can do for you when they've tried everything else and you're still not able to breathe on your own.
Had to be scary. But you can read Blake's column at TCPalm.com about his experience with COVID and what his thoughts are on getting a vaccine. So obviously that is a big issue, something we've written all too much about over the last 18 months or so. What are you looking forward to writing in the future? You have the Stewart election coming up. What else is sort of on your horizon?
Well, I am the columnist for both St. Lucie and Martin County, and I feel like I need to get up and start doing more in St. Lucie County, because I've sort of, the first few columns I've done have kind of skewed more toward the Martin County side, but I think over time that's all going to even out. I think it's just been the fact that there have been a number of issues in Martin County that interested me right off the bat that I knew about. And as I get to know both communities better, I'm sure I'm going to see more things that are going on up there that I'm interested in. I mean, they've got a mayor's race coming up next month, and in Port St. Lucie, and that's not a small town. I was very, talking about first impressions, surprised how big Port St. Lucie is, not just in terms of population, but also geographically. I think that there are towns that have signs that tell you when you're entering or leaving the city limits. But with Port St. Lucie, they also need to have some signs that say you're still in Port St. Lucie.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty big Jacksonville. Obviously, you work there. That's a pretty big place. Obviously, that's the county, so that's got to be. But Port St. Lucie is pretty big. And we've got the mayor race coming up, and you've got the special election for the council as well. And we'll be doing editorial board interviews in August on those. The editorial board will interview the candidates, do some research beforehand on the candidates, and then ultimately may make a decision to endorse one or more candidates in those races. We've decided not to endorse in the Stewart race because it seems like we just did. It was a year ago.
Right.
But anyway, you will be writing about it for the weekend. It's very timely because early voting starts Monday in that. What else can we talk about, Blake? Anything else you'd like to talk about?
Since you're on that election, I mean, the thing that, spoiler alert, talking about my column for Sunday, one of the things that I really want to stress in that, and I think we may also touch on this in an editorial as well, but there's only one race on the ballot, one contested race on the ballot. There's another candidate who's running unopposed, but there's only the one contested race in Stewart. If you live outside the city limits of Stewart, you're not eligible to vote. So it's likely to be a very low turnout election. I mean, there aren't other races, there's no presidential race or gubernatorial race on the ballot that would help bring people to the polls. So you're potentially looking at a very low turnout race. And, that's always a concern for me. I mean, I just think democracy works best when a lot of people are participating in it. And, if only a fraction of the total number of eligible voters come out, then, it's unfortunate. And that's something I'm planning to say in the column. So, but please read it anyway.
Well, hopefully it's a good column. It explains a lot about that race and some of the reasons for it, and what the turnout very well may be like. So, definitely check it out. It should be on TCPalm Friday in your edition of the Stewart News on Sunday. And with that, I appreciate you taking the time tonight, Blake, to join me and just talk about this. And I hope we can get together more often in settings like this and with other people and discuss some other interesting issues.
Sounds good.
So for TCPalm and Treasure Coast newspapers, thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll catch you later.